So for all the reasons I told you earlier, now we know that we need to conserve the genetic resource. We need to conserve biodiversity. And for conserving biodiversity, there are a few objectives in place. First one is, yes, definitely, you have to make sure that the biodiversity is being protected from use and abuse. But you can't tell people not to use something, not to use the, plants and animals around them. We need to use them for all our regular, life support system. But we also need to make sure that the essential ecological processes are being maintained. Along with that, we have to ensure that there is sustainable utilization of the species and sustainable utilization of the ecosystems. What does sustainable utilization mean? It means that you use the natural resources in such a way that you don't destroy them completely, but they can be utilized by the future generations as well. So it's something similar to live and let live. You use and you let your future generations also use. That is what is called as sustainable utilization. So these are the objectives which are kept in mind when strategies for conservation are made. Now, there are basically two different types of strategies. We can either have in situ strategies for conservation, or we can have XC2 strategies for conservation. In situ is on site, in the place where the conservation needs to happen. You do it at that particular area, then it is called as in situ, in the habitat, in the natural habitat. XC2 is the opposite, which means external to the natural habitat, outside the natural habitat. When we do the conservation, that is called as XC2. So what we'll be looking at are a few in situ and XC2 strategies for conservation of biodiversity. In situ, that is on site, when we are trying to conserve the biodiversity, you can either have biosphere reserves or national parks or wildlife sanctuaries. Now, biosphere reserves are large areas. In fact, biosphere reserve can have national park and wildlife sanctuaries inside it. So these are huge areas that are there in many of the nations. In fact, India has 18 biosphere reserves. So these biosphere reserves are used for, research purpose. You make sure that such areas, there's no competition between the wild and the domesticated animals. You make sure that the habitat is being maintained. You are limiting the usage by human beings. So with all these measures in place, the in situ strategies are designed so that you not only save the animals or the plants, you also save the habitat. That is also important. So biosphere reserves look something like this. You can see over here, there are 3 zones that are demarcated. The innermost zone is the core area. The core area is where you will only have research activity. If there are any scientists who want to work on that particular region to know more about the plants and animals there, only they can work in the core zone. No other humans are allowed. Absolutely zero interference by human beings. The next area is the buffer zone. Buffer zone is wherein you can have research activities. There may be even some, some kind of human settlements will be there, or a small range of human settlements will be there. There will be some kind of research activities that are going on. So those what are happening, like even a bit of tourism, a bit of grazing is allowed. That is allowed in the buffer zone, what is shown by dark blue over here. So buffer zone is the second zone. The last region, what is shown, the outermost zone, is called as a transition zone. Transition zone allows limited human settlements. Crops are also allowed to be grown over here. So that area is called as the transition zone. These are the 3 different zones of a biosphere reserve. The second type of in situ strategy is a national park. National park is for protecting the ecosystem. That is, you protect the plants, you protect the animals, and you protect the area. That is called as national park. There are many national parks in India. So as of now, we have 106 national parks in India. The third one is wildlife sanctuaries. Wildlife sanctuaries are areas which are designed to protect animals and plants. They don't protect the ecosystem so much. The main idea for wildlife sanctuary is to make sure that the animals and plants are able to live in that particular area in their own natural habitat. So as of now, we have 567 wildlife sanctuaries in India. There are many wildlife sanctuaries and national parks, and I'm sure there'll be one in your state as well, which you might have heard of or which you might have even visited. So these are the different in situ strategies for conservation. That is, you're protecting the wildlife, you're protecting the biodiversity in their natural habitat. when you're protecting the biodiversity outside their habitat in a particular controlled environment, you make the environment. It's not their natural area. You make an environment and let them grow. That is called as XC2 strategy. The first example for this is zoological parks, or basically zoos. So zoo or a botanical garden like you see over here, these are all examples where you grow some plants. You take a huge area, you grow plants over there, or you have cages where you start breeding animals. That is what you call as the XC2 strategy, a controlled environment outside their original habitat, outside their natural habitat. We also have seed banks or gene banks, wherein this is an example of a seed bank where you are storing the seeds or you're storing the genetic material. This is done with the help of a technique called as cryopreservation, where you use really cold temperatures to preserve the seeds or to preserve the genetic material. So these are also examples of XC2 strategies. And there's also one term that is there which is called as captive breeding. Captive breeding is when you are allowing the animals to breed, you're allowing them to mate, to reproduce in a controlled environment. So it is something, it is synonymous with XC2 strategy, that is called as captive breeding. Now you can also harvest wildlife. So there's a great potential to use animals and plants even commercially. Their edible parts, their medicines. Many commercial products are being extracted from whales. Foxes are being used for fur. So there is use of wildlife where you can harvest them. But then we need to be careful that we don't, it does not lead to misuse of the wildlife. That needs to be kept in mind. The last part of your unit is the different conservation strategies that are in place at the national and international level. So there are these 6 strategies that have been specifically mentioned in your syllabus, and we'll be looking at what each of these is about. Okay, so I have written what the strategy is or what that particular organization is, and then I have also written the year in which it was implemented. So the first one here is the IUCN. IUCN is the full form for International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. International Union for Conservation, IUCN. N stands for Nature and Natural Resources. Now this is an organization. This is a body. In fact, it is the world's largest and the oldest environmental organization, which was founded in 1948. One way for you to remember is it was 1 year after we received our freedom. So international organization which is involved in nature conservation and making sure that there is sustainable use of natural resources across the world. So this organization actually, helps the governments, various businesses. It advises them, it influences their action so that they can conserve the diversity of nature in that particular country. They can conserve the integrity of the nature. So they are acting like a consultant body. They are helping the organizations and the governments to ensure that there is conservation of nature and natural resources in that country. Their headquarters is in Gland in Switzerland, and they are comprised of members including both governments as well as NGOs, that is non-governmental organizations. There is one important thing that the IUCN does, that is they publish a red data book. Red data book is a collection or a compilation which includes the list of endangered species, endangered plants, endangered animals. So they release this red data book. It's now called as Red List, but they release this red data book, which is very important for us to know the status of various animals and plants in the world. Are they endangered? Are they close to extinction? Or are they safe? Are there enough numbers? All that is being compiled, all that is being listed out in the red data book. They also run a lot of projects for the conservation of habitat, conservation of species. In fact, they were the ones who set up the World Wildlife Fund in 1961. So they are basically an organization involved in conservation. Like the name says, they are involved in conservation of nature and natural resources. The next one is the Ramsar Convention. Ramsar Convention is a convention. See, convention is like an agreement that is being signed internationally. So here the parties are the different governments, the different countries. So Ramsar Convention is also called as Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, or it is also just called as Convention on Wetlands. It was signed in 1971. Now it's signed in a place called as Ramsar in Iran. That's why it's called as Ramsar Convention. The name is by the name of the city where it was signed. Now this convention, this agreement was done or signed to stop the encroachment of wetlands. Wetlands are basically like marshy lands, areas which are always underwater, either seasonally or annually. There'll be a lot of water in such areas, and such wetlands are excellent sources of ecosystem, because in such areas you find a lot of diversity in plants, animals, insects, birds. Lot of diversity is found in such areas. To prevent people from taking over the wetlands and making settlements and factories over there, that is why in 1971 they came up with this Ramsar Convention, and every country who signs that convention, every country who signs that agreement is bound to make sure that they take care of their wetlands. So this is like providing a framework for conserving the wetlands, making sure that the wetlands are being used wisely and their resources are being safeguarded, are being conserved. So it is very important for us, not only ecologically, economically, scientifically, wetlands are very important. So these are the different uses of wetlands, and Ramsar Convention is an agreement which helps us to conserve the wetlands. This is just one newspaper article I have put up over here, which is telling about how many Ramsar sites were added in 2022, and in August 2022, in fact, 26 Ramsar sites were added. That is, globally they were recognized as, these are really important areas, and 26 such areas were added. Now, in India, we have 75 Ramsar sites. That is, areas that are recognized as of international importance, wetlands of international importance. This article tells us about the first Ramsar site of the state of Karnataka, that is the Ranganthittu bird sanctuary. That area is now considered as a Ramsar site, which is a big deal, because that means it's a really important region and you need to make sure you are conserving it. So Ramsar Convention is an agreement, or a sort of treaty that is signed between the different governments for conservation of wetlands, which year was it signed in 1971. Okay, this is something that you need to remember. The third one is the Wildlife Protection Act. This is an act of the Government of India. So this act was implemented by Government of India in 1972, and it provides for protection of wild animals, birds, plants, and anything that is related with wildlife. Any matter that is related to wildlife and its protection is what is covered under this Wildlife Protection Act. So this act is comprising of 6 schedules, or 6 parts, which are providing varying degrees of protection. Like one schedule will tell you that it's okay to kill this animal. For example, a rat. It's okay to kill the rat if it is causing trouble. However, in another schedule, it will tell you about animals that you absolutely cannot harm. For example, a Bengal tiger. So these schedules are basically listing out the different animals and plants and what is the degree of protection, absolute protection, or which can be hunted freely, etc. Even plants, it talks about plants as well. It also told about the constitution of a wildlife advisory board and the job that board has to do. The members of the board, what is their roles, what is their role, what are their duties, that was clearly listed out in this Wildlife Protection Act. It also listed out, for the first time in India, we listed out the endangered species of India. The Wildlife Protection Act also told to set up national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, constitution of the Central Zoo Authority. All these organizations, all such protected areas were actually set up after Wildlife Protection Act. And then it also tells about the ban on trade or commerce of the animals or plants which are listed under this schedule. Not only that, if people do partake in trade, or they do some kind of selling or exporting or importing of such animal products or plant products, then what are the offenses, their punishment, the penalty that they have to pay, that is also listed out in the act. So the Wildlife Protection Act, like the name says, is for protection of the wildlife. There were acts before this as well, but then with this act, a lot of details were actually spelled out by the government, and this came into place in 1972. It was implemented in 1972 by the Parliament of India. So we have done 3 till now. We have spoken about the first one that we looked at was IUCN. That is an organization that is working for conservation of nature and the natural resources. Then we looked at the Ramsar Convention, which is for protection of wetlands. Then we looked at the Wildlife Protection Act, which is for protection, conservation of wildlife in India, that was implemented in 1972. The next one is Project Tiger. Project Tiger was one of the projects that was, implemented or started under the Wildlife Protection Act. So Wildlife Protection Act has many projects it has taken up. One of the projects that it started was in the Project Tiger in 1973. This Project Tiger was actually launched with support from World Wildlife Fund, that is WWF, and like you can see, it is for conservation of tigers. So India is home to 70% of the world's tiger population, and it had really gone down. In the beginning of 20th century, we had around 20,000 to 40,000 tigers. But by 1970s, there were only 1,200 tigers left. So they realized that the number of tigers is drastically coming down. If we don't take care now, they'll go extinct. So that is when this Project Tiger was launched, to ensure that there is a viable population of Bengal tigers in their natural habitats. They are able to live in their natural habitat. You protect them from extinction, check illegal poaching, make sure they are not being hunted illegally. You provide the habitat for them. This was the main aim or objective of the Project Tiger. And after the Project Tiger was introduced, when we introduced it, there were only 9 tiger reserves in our country. Now we have 53 tiger reserves. So these tiger reserves are basically providing an area. They are divided as a core area surrounded by a buffer area. So this core area is where there's no human activity, and this peripheral zone is called as a buffer area, where there is a small level of activity, lesser degree of habitat protection is found in the buffer area. Basically, a tiger reserve is like a biosphere reserve, which is providing protection for the tigers. It is providing habitat for the tigers, and it is allowing the tigers to grow and proliferate there. For example, you might have heard of Ranthambore Sanctuary, or Ranthambore is a tiger reserve. Sundarban is a tiger reserve. We have Annamalai Tiger Reserve in the south. So there are many tiger reserves that are there in the country. To be specific, 53 in numbers, and now the number of tigers has come up to almost 3,000. This was in 2018 census. It has almost come up to 3,000 now. So that is why this Project Tiger is one of the most successful projects in the country. For environmental projects, it has been really successful because we have been able to significantly improve the number of tigers. And this project was implemented in 1973. So this is something that you need to remember about Project Tiger. The next one is abbreviated as CITES. It stands for Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This, like the name says, all you need to do is remember the name. To remember the name, you can remember the logo. You can see over here, there's an elephant tusk which has been shown over here. So this convention, again, it's a convention like Ramsar Convention, which means it's an agreement that is signed by different countries. This agreement was signed in 1973, same year as Project Tiger, in a meeting of all the IUCN members, and it was done to ensure that the international trade of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. It was mainly started because there was a lot of trade that was happening of elephant tusks. That is why you can see the elephant tusk over here. Elephant tusks were being, there was a lot of international trading that was going on. Rhino horns were being traded. Tiger skin was being traded. Many animal products were being traded, especially from, poor countries which had the source. For example, in African continent, this problem was really high because they were poverty stricken. They needed the money. So they were ready to kill the animals and make the money. So to regulate the wildlife trade, international wildlife trade, and not just of animals, but also of plants, so that their survival is not threatened, so that, they are taken care of, so that the trade can be legal, it can be sustainable, traceable. That is why this convention was signed by the various countries. After this convention provides a framework for every nation's legislation, what that nation should do, that nation should decide. But they provide a framework. They provide like a sort of skeleton. They have 3 appendices. Each of the appendices is listing out a species of varying protection. So something similar to our Wildlife Protection Act, but this is for the international trade. It is to control the trade of the wildlife products between countries. In fact, recently, on March 3rd, it was the 50th anniversary of this particular convention. The last one is the Convention on Biological Diversity. So Convention on Biodiversity, that is also abbreviated as CBD, was signed in 1992. This is something which has been a real, a massive convention that was signed by all the countries. So this, almost all the countries. This convention on biodiversity was, started, or it was opened for signature at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. There are three major objectives of this convention. One is to conserve biodiversity. Like the name says, Convention on Biodiversity, it is to conserve biodiversity. To sustainably use its components. I've told you about sustainable use. Sustainable is wherein you make sure that there is usage, but then enough is left for the future generations as well. So they're not destroyed completely. That needs to be taken care. And the last one is sharing of the benefits from the genetic resources. So what if there is a particular biodiversity that is being sold or marketed or being commercially available, make sure there is fair sharing. So if something from India is being sold by an American company, India also needs to be given the benefit. That is a rough translation of fair and equitable sharing of benefits. These were the three goals of this Convention on Biological Biodiversity, which was signed in 1992. So these were the different topics that were under your unit. We have looked at what biodiversity is. We have looked at how man is a super consumer and hence is affecting the biodiversity. What are the actions of man and what are the effects on biodiversity? We have looked at why we need to conserve biodiversity. That is the reason for conservation. We have seen the strategies for conservation, XC2 as well as in situ, and we have also seen a few conventions and organizations that are really putting a lot of efforts to conserve biodiversity. I hope this review was useful to all of you. I'll be uploading the reviews for other chapters as well, and I hope you come and visit that as well. Thank you so much.